Please, if you'll join me for the podium, because we're beginning in and we're in the blue suits today. I can see. Me too. Just a few minutes before it's 9 o'clock. And in the meantime, I can say hello to Nitin sitting over here. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. See you later. If anyone needs another cup of coffee, it's time to grab it now. There's just another minute before we open today's event. So, good morning, a warm and dry good morning inside of the Dan Church 8. Outside it's pouring down here in Copenhagen. I hope the rest of you following us online are inside out of the rain. A very good morning to all of you on behalf of the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Confederation of Danish Industries, Global Center on Adaptation, and of course Dan Church 8 hosting us today. A warm welcome also to those of you joining us online. My name is Mette Vibe Utzon. I'll do my very best to guide us through the next couple of hours and unfold for you today what exactly does unlocking private investments in adaptation mean. I've been asking that question to everyone I could find who I thought had an answer, so I'm looking forward to unfold those answers with you today. I have a few practical informations to give you before we open the floor to our keynote speakers. One is that all the information given to you today will be available to you afterwards, after this event today. For those of you online, you'll be sent, emailed all the information, and there's also the report, the physical report outside here where you find the coffee as well. I should also remind you that since we are streaming online today, this event, there is a possibility that you may be in the picture. Since you're here today, I guess, and I hope that will be all right with you. You will have the opportunity to ask questions, both physically and also online, for our keynote speakers and also for the roundtable presentation later on. For those of you following online, please write your question in the chat. But let's begin our program this morning by giving a welcome to our keynote speakers. Dan Jørgensen, Minister for Development, Cooperation and Global Climate Policy, Professor Dr. Patrick Verkooyen, CEO for Global Center on Adaptation, Thomas Bustrup, Deputy CEO for the Confederation of Danish Industries, and of course our host today, to whom I will now give the floor, Secretary General of Dan Church 8, Birgitte Kvist Sørensen. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Minister, distinguished guests, partners, colleagues, I'm so pleased that the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Danish Industries, the Global Center of Adaptation and DCA, that we've actually come together jointly to shed light on the importance of private investments in climate adaptation, and even more also the need. My job today will be to deliver the convincing arguments. We work in some of the most climate-affected countries in the world, where adaptation is no longer a choice, but it's a necessity. Climate change is a very present threat to the poor and vulnerable communities. The recent IPCC report highlights that adaptation is needed now, and that more than 3 billion people around the world live in vulnerable communities. And adaptation is needed to handle the current climate threats, but the crisis in general. In other words, time is now. I've just been to Uganda, where they say now, now. So what is adaptation? Adaptation is about how do we manage too little rain, too much rain, erratic storms, hails, whereas climate mitigation is about reducing emissions and make sure that the world is not heating up more than it's already done. So there's a big difference. Maybe in Denmark we don't think much about adaptation, but still, here in Denmark we also have rain or drought. We've had very dry summers, but it doesn't affect our livelihoods as much as it does in the countries where we work. This is an ongoing debate. We started it in 2019, where the Global Commission on Adaptation presented its report, Adapt Now, where we also talked about adaptation. So just to stress, the situation for the smallholder farmers has become really bad. It's going from bad to worse. In our report, which I hope you will grab on your way in or on your way out, it states that 500 million smallholder farmers and their families and communities contribute more than 30% of the global food production, and they're the ones the hardest hit. Right now, we experience the worst drought in the Horn of Africa in 40 years. It hasn't rained for 5 seasons. That's 3 years. And in a relatively still developing country, but wealthy country, in Kenya alone, 2.5 million livestock has died because of the drought. So that was kind of setting the scene. So it's a bit uphill now coming with the convincing arguments why you should invest in this. But I think what is needed is that we work together, as we stand here with the private sector, NGOs, research institutions, donors, development banks, investors. We have a perfect mix for making the changes that people face around the world, that people in vulnerable communities face. I've just returned from Uganda, as I said, talked to farmers and refugees, all women, as it happened, who are engaged in producing sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are a drought-resistant crop. The project actually started together with a Danish fruit import company who said, could we source from Africa? And instead of flying from South America, maybe we could transport by containers. And we started out with sweet potatoes because it's a drought-resistant crop. The project is a success. It has scalability. The farmers got access to microfinance, the refugees saved up money to lease more land, and the Ugandan companies got access to funding from development banks. So there are opportunities when we work together. I think what is needed is types of drought-resistant crops, but also crops that can grow in salt water. In Denmark, we have one of the biggest biotech science clusters in Denmark that has a lot of innovation going. In general, I think we have a lot going for us. I think what is needed is that private sector understands the idea of adaptation and, of course, understands that you can make money on it. And I think you can. All the private sector companies we're working with, they are actually bringing money to the table. They know it's risky, but that's where Danita comes in and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We get a very generous frame grant. I always call it the risk-willing capital that we can put into the projects. And then there are many other instruments that actually takes away risk from private companies to invest. But I think what I have learned, I was out meeting the staff in Novozymes, and for them to hear what we were saying we've been doing together, also thought, okay, we're about to make change for the many million people who need solutions now. So I think the winning argument is it's not impossible. We can do it. We have many ideas. So it's just about sitting together, standing together, developing ideas with our good local partners in the countries where we work.
Now, that's the new trend. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Birgitte. And let's pass the word to Dan Jørgensen, Minister for Development, Cooperation and Global Climate Policy.
much, and first of all, thank you for organizing this event on this extremely important topic. I think I will start by taking you all to Ethiopia. I went there a couple of months ago and visited Addis, obviously, but also the Dhafar region. And the Dhafar region is the hottest inhabited place on the planet. So it gets hot. It's more than 30 degrees now, and in the summertime it's more than 50 degrees. So for the people living there, that it's hot, it's not really that much of a problem because it's been hot for thousands of years. What is a problem is that it's just a few degrees hotter than usually, and there 1 or 2 degrees means a lot. But even more importantly, as Birgitte mentioned, it hasn't rained for 3 years. So this means that even the camels die from thirst. When that happens, obviously the whole livelihood disappears. What then happens? Well, the girls are not allowed to go to school. The development that might have been underway stops. Everything comes to a halt. This is a very good example of why it is that climate change is an accelerator of all the other problems that we have in many of these most vulnerable countries. From an idealistic point of view, if you look at it with the optics of what is fair, what is just in this world, it's unbearable that the least developed countries that are only responsible for 4% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are the ones hit the hardest already now. And this is why the now should be the new catchphrase, because it is here now. You're probably also all aware of the typhoons now in Eastern Africa. I spoke to the Minister of Finance from Malawi, telling me that, you know, normally they will get a typhoon once every 10 years. Now they have 3 or 4 every year. And right now, 1/3 of the energy infrastructure of the country is down because of this. That's just one concrete example. So it's here right now. Okay, so in Dhafar, what we try to do to help is some of the projects that we do with the World Bank, which are projects that we've done for, if not decades, then definitely a long time, is to give people grants to do some work. So they go to work every day for 5 or 7 hours. They get a grant to, not a big amount, but enough to make a living, basically, right? And after 3 or 4 years, they get an even bigger grant so that they can make their own small business. And there's education and all of that connected to it. But the work that they then actually do is related to climate resistance, climate adaptation. So in Dhafar, they make water reservoirs to collect the water, to make sure that the camels and the livestock have something to drink. So this is actually a project that's, the main focus is to eradicate poverty, but it's also a climate adaptation project. Now, in Addis, the same country, the problem is that people are drowning, metaphorically speaking. Because when the rain actually falls, it doesn't very often, but when it does, it comes too fast, too much, so it floods the city. So in the same country, we have camels dying from thirst and people, metaphorically speaking, drowning from the water. The same type of project where we pay people to do work, in Addis, they go to the hills and make them resistant for the water when it comes. So these examples are obviously small projects. Nonetheless, I like to use them because it tells, for instance, my colleagues in the European Union that money spent wisely doesn't have to be either education, human rights, poverty, or climate adaptation. They can be both. And if I ask colleagues in African countries whether or not they see a conflict between those targets, they just shake their heads. Of course not. There hasn't, I mean, for 10 years they will say For us, every day, it's interconnected. So I guess that's probably the most important point, that we need to be better at explaining and be better at also convincing policymakers and private investors all over the world that is actually the case right now. So from the Danish government side, we've decided to spend 30% of our development aid for green purposes. But we never spent one single krone or dollar or euro or whatever for a project that's only a mitigation project, for instance. It might be a mitigation project, but very often it will also be something else. Or not very often, always it will also be something else. So it will target 3 or 4 or 5 sustainable development goals. But of those 30%, by the way, 25% is climate, 5% is nature and environment and biodiversity. Of the 25%, 60% is adaptation. And I think that, first of all, it's important we make a difference with those money, but what's even more important is that it sets a precedent, hopefully, sets an example. So Secretary General Guterres mentioned Denmark and the Netherlands, I think, actually, as the 2 only countries before the COP in Glasgow that did this, that spent more than 50% of our aid on adaptation. So we need to use our examples to get others to follow, because even though the topic of today is how to mobilize private investments, and by that obviously we also hope to be able to convince private investors that they can actually make money in these projects, even though that is a valid point and that is important, probably the most important task that we have. Still, as Birgitte said, we need governments to start doing this, also because we're able to, did you call it risk-willing capital? We're able to provide that more than private investors obviously are. So that would be my first and probably most important point from my chair is we need to spend this money on these purposes, and it's all interconnected. Second point, even Denmark, even you, Patrick, and I know because I just asked you, even us, we struggle to actually define some of the key concepts, to actually give some of the best examples. And this is because it's complex, this is because it's difficult, but it might seem a bit trivial to talk about narratives and methodology, but it's really important, because if we don't do this, then we will lose the struggle of the narrative. I have to be honest and say I don't think we are on a track to winning it right now. By we, I mean all of us that thinks this is very important. We just had a Copenhagen Climate Ministerial in Copenhagen last week, 45 delegations from all over the world, ministers, negotiators. Good news is most of these people agree that adaptation is extremely important. We've decided in Glasgow to double adaptation funding. Fantastic. But bad news is we're speaking about different things. We don't have set definition of what is adaptation. We don't even know what we're actually talking about when we discuss a global target for adaptation, which we should almost be done negotiating it now, but we don't even know what it is.
That's a big relief for me, Daniel.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
No, but this is also a chance, right? Because engaged people that are here today, I mean, if we put all of our energy into it and our competences and our knowledge, then we also have a window of opportunity now to set the record, right? But if we don't do it, then I think it will be difficult. It will be difficult to persuade governments, but even more difficult to persuade companies and private investors, because if we cannot even tell them what it is we want them to invest in, and how we define it, and how we guarantee that it's actually also a good business opportunity, then it's difficult. I've already spoken for too long, so I'll make it brief. All of this is also, of course, connected to this discussion about reform of the MDBs, especially the World Bank. I will be going to Washington the week after next. And I actually do think that the reform of the World Bank that I'm quite confident will happen will also be a breakthrough in this regard. Right now, there's a sort of an artificial conflict out there where some countries argue that we should not lose sight of poverty eradication as the main purpose, and others saying it needs only to focus on climate. It's ludicrous because we need to look at it as being one combined topic. And when I ask again African ministers, they shake their heads. How it doesn't make sense for them. So the reason the conflict has been made is that, theoretically speaking, and if we do it the wrong way, then that conflict is there. Because obviously, if we spend money that we would have spent on fighting poverty, on making a wind turbine farm that would have been made anyway, because it's good business, then the conflict is there. But it is so obvious that so many countries, so many sectors, are so high demand for investments in projects that does not entail this conflict, that does the opposite. So I hope very much that we will find compromises, and I hope very much that we will reach at least 3 results in the World Bank. One, change the goal and targets and ways of working of the bank so that it also starts focusing on climate, both mitigation and adaptation. 2, that the internal structures of the World Bank are, you know, much more than me about this, Patrick, but that they are also changed so that it becomes more flexible. And 3rd, most importantly, that we make it possible for the World Bank to be able to generate investments of a much larger scale, also outside of the bank's own abilities. And even though it is difficult, it is an opportunity now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jan. In other words, all the stupid questions, and I promise you I'll ask some of them myself, because my education entitles me to do so, but you're welcome after our presentations as well to ask any question that you might would like to have an answer for. But now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Dr. Patrick Vercoyen, CEO for Global Center on Adaptation. You can explain to us what adaptation is.
Well, before we do so, I would just thank Brigitte for setting the scene from Uganda, and also you, Minister, for taking us, mentally at least, to Ethiopia. And I would like to invite you to join me in a sort of a mental journey to the C-suite, to the boardroom. Because my central message today is that climate change is crashing the bottom line of global business. So we're all in the climate emergency. You explained that from different perspectives. We know more floods, more droughts, more storms. And we're all in this together. But my concern before we come to adaptation is my major sort of headache when I wake up in the middle of the night is that the climate agenda writ large is even actually, politically speaking, quite frankly, at the background, right? The Ukraine crisis, the debt crisis, the inflation crisis, the cost of living crisis, it seems that takes over now in terms of prioritization of sort of action globally speaking. But at the same time, we also know that the climate, let's say, emergency is this magnifying glass which makes all these other crises much more pertinent. So you, Minister, you referenced Antonio Guterres before Glasgow. But since Glasgow, he also said, actually, before we talk about adaptation, let's not forget that we first have to invest in mitigation massively. We are on this road to climate hell, as he called it, even, let's say, which turns into sort of a biblical hell if we're not going to act in that fast. But even if we were to adhere to the agreement from 2015 in Paris of the 1.5-degree world, we still have a massive obligation to invest in adaptation, not only to survive, but quite frankly, to thrive. As we discussed this morning, to disclose that, Honourable Minister, I think it's fair to say there has been some progress on adaptation. It's not all doom and gloom, right? the doubling of adaptation finance commitment is a fundamental breakthrough in the international architecture, quite frankly, on the climate debate. Let's go back to Africa. I think it's quite significant that in the last 2 years, African heads of state and government, they said, well, actually, if you international community commit to doubling adaptation finance, well, it's great. Let us put a plan on the table for you to co-finance, which is the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, AAAP, the largest program in the world on adaptation finance, $25 billion over 5 years for food security and nature-based solutions, infrastructure, youth enterprise, and climate finance across. That's massive. The same reality is, the same African leaders have actually talking about doubling adaptation finance. How much is flowing today to Africa on climate adaptation on an annual basis? $11 billion. But how much is needed? If you just add up all the NDCs and NAPs and you look at the investment needs of these countries on aggregate, it's $51 billion. So there is a $40 billion delta. And with all the good sort of commitments of development partners, that can never be sort of filled by development partners alone. I want to do a specific shout out to you, Mr. Minister, because you are in a unique position. Why? Because you're a development minister and you're a minister of global climate policy, which is very rare to combine that. But more importantly, or as important, what Denmark is doing, which setting the target of the 60% of sort of ground-based finance for adaptation, that is unmatched globally. It is an extraordinary accomplishment, knowing that also here in Europe is the Ukraine crisis. I'm sure you have lots of pressure on your budget, so I really want to thank you for being a source of inspiration to the world. Having said that, you indicated, Mr. Minister, there is a battle for the narrative. So let's go back to the C-suite. I mean, some of you are in the C-suite, maybe some of you are very busy online and doing, managing a business and listening to this conversation. The battle for the narrative should start and end with breaking down 3 myths. That's basically what I want to share with you. Myth 1 is that folks say there is no movement on climate adaptation from the business community. It's not my business. Wrong. If you're a business leader, if you're a CFO, in Davos last January, there were over the largest 100 companies were interviewed. There was a questionnaire. What is the implication of climate change on your financial bottom line? And basically monetize that. It's equal to 10% of their annual sales. So there is already a large implication on your financial bottom line today. So sitting on the fence and saying, you know what, it's government's business, it's church aid's business, I think that's the wrong approach for business to take. The second myth, it's too costly. We as business cannot invest because it's simply too expensive. Wrong. Because as we learned, Peter, from your work in the Global Commission on Adaptation, it makes economic sense to invest in adaptation. Why? Because every dollar, euro, kroner invested in adaptation has a much higher return as opposed to not investing. Yes, of course.
You will meet Peter later on.
Precisely, and Peter will just say that much more sophisticated than I will do now. But what Peter perhaps also may say is, yes, if you invest in resilient infrastructure, indeed, there is an upfront cost of additionally 3%, but if you invest that dollar, euro, pound in a resilient infrastructure, your return is 1 to 4. It makes, again, economic sense to invest. And the last point is, we're too late to invest, right? There is no business case which has a spin-off in revenue generation. Well, quite frankly, if you are in the weather and data collection industry, if you're in the insurance industry, there's money to be made in adaptation. Why? The crisis is spinning out of control. More money from governments will be coming into the adaptation space. So if you position yourself as an entrepreneur of the 21st century, you should be on that cost curve and grab that market. I think that is sort of where the business community should come in. It is smart economics. It's good for the business, for your bottom line, and there's money to be made. And last point, I know it's easy to say this, and I also know there shouldn't be a dichotomy between government and business. If you go to Davos, I'm sure some of you do, every single year since Copenhagen 2009, in Davos there is a group called the Climate Business Leadership Group. The 125 largest companies in the world. And what they're going to talk about, but they talk about climate mitigation. We know by now that close to 2,000 large businesses have set mitigation, net zero targets. Now it's time for them also to get on the adaptation journey. That's why we're delighted as GCA to set up a dedicated business platform together with government, but with the business community, to indeed provide the data, the analytics, the codification to win the battle and the narrative on climate adaptation for business is good for your bottom line. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. We've come to the end of the line. The three representatives here that have already spoken have done their utmost to convince all the industries that they should take part of this, right? I was thinking the same thing. It's easy for you to say, Patrick. So what do you say, Thomas Booster? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And all my three fellow panelists here has started by sort of explaining the huge challenges that we are facing, not least in the developing world. I saw in one of your reports, I think, that on the African continent there are 50 natural disasters, sort of on average, a year. That's one a week. I know it's a big continent, but still that's incredible. And it's not natural disasters like we have in Denmark, because we have a heavy wind with a little bit of rainfall, and it's all over the news. I mean, these are, you mentioned it, some of them. So of course there is an extreme burning platform, and we need mitigation investments in order to ensure that there are not more than 50 in the future. But the time is really running out. It's now. And I learned that from Birgitte, now.
Everybody will be saying now.
That will be the word of today. It will be now. And it's like, I mean, it's like having a bad disease and not going to the doctor because you think that one day it will probably be gone. Most likely it will not, and it will be over. So that's what we are facing. And in terms of these money that you also mentioned, Patrick, on the investments needed in adaptation, huge amounts. And I think we all know that the private sector is crucial to get on board in this. Of course, because of the technologies, because of the know-how, but also because of the financing, the money. And is the private sector engaged today? Yes, it is. Companies, also Danish companies, are engaged. And why are they engaged? One reason is what you explained. It's good business. You need to find maybe other ways of looking at your business model, but if you can find those ways, it can be very good business. It's often related to more risks, because it's also investments in countries that will mean that it's more risky. I mean, let's face that. But of course, also from a financial point of view, it's more risky. But a lot of companies, they still go for it, and that's good. Other companies are looking at in a way that they say, okay, they cannot see the right business model here from a financial point of view or from a risk control point of view, but they still do it. Because they have the technology, they have the know-how, they feel an obligation, and they want to make a difference, they want to make a change, so they still go for it. So instead of investing in Sweden, they go for it. And they benefit on a lot of other issues than just the financing, which is important, and they go for it. If you take those two groups together and add it up, you still don't get whether it's 11 billion or 51 billion US dollars. It's no near what you actually need. So what we need to do is to engage all the companies sort of in the middle, the ones that are turning down the C-suites, the CFOs, the risk committees of the board that are turning down these projects because the risk and the reward balance is not quite good enough. It is simply too risky, not only from a financial point of view, but also from a reputational point of view. We all know that companies, especially in Denmark, if they end up in some kind of situation, in some kind of developing country where something had happened that would not happen in their operation in Copenhagen, they get on the front page of the newspaper and they have a huge risk in terms of their reputation. So these are also things that more and more come into the C-suites and actually mean that these projects are turned down. So if we should reach the amounts necessary for adaptation investments, we need to engage all the companies that are sort of saying no to business proposals because financially and in terms of their reputation is too risky. And this is where the public-private partnership comes in. They need to have instruments, they need to have backing of public organizations and national organizations so that the C-suites, the CFOs, they say, okay, with that backing, we will do it because we do want to do a difference. And if we have somebody that can de-risk the project, both from a financial point of view, then they would actually go for it instead of going for the investment in Sweden. Nothing against Sweden, but I think that is really what we have to look at. If you go in deeper, what is then needed, I completely agree. The narrative is extremely important. DI here also have a huge responsibility in explaining this to the Danish business community. I mean, the risk of not doing anything. So that's one important thing. Then data is important. I mean, they need to see data so they can actually construct projects of adaptation related to what is the problem. I mean, data on the real problem that they are facing. National adaptation plans, I mean, to see, okay, in which countries what is more necessary than others, in what kind of order, plans that they can dig into and say, oh, this is where my technology, this is where my knowledge can actually do a difference. And then finally, as I already touched upon, I mean, any kind of public-private instruments, things that can add up so that we can have projects where we are both public and private financing technologies and knowledge. That would be my...
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas Buchholz. So, in other words, here we have the strongest backup group that you'll ever find, right? They all want what is best, not only for Africa. We've been to Uganda, to Ethiopia. They also want what's best for Danish companies. Is that correct, what I'm concluding? Yes. So now I'll open the floor to questions, both the virtual floor and the physical one. So please, if you have a question, raise your hand and present yourself. And if we have ones online, there is one online already.
Thank you. My name is Matthias. I'm from Danchurch, but I will just assist with the online questions. And there is one question about, is there any hope? Because we know that there are so few private investments in adaptation today. So what gives you hope? What makes you believe that this is actually going to work? Do you see any signs?
Begin?
Well, I mean, I don't think I could be in the business I'm in if I didn't have hope. I think, and what I try to say is that there are so many examples out there. I mean, I travel there, I see it, I experience it, and there are so many examples of good initiatives, of bankable projects. I think our challenge is actually to do things like here, but also to push the business community to see these opportunities, because they're there, and we have many solutions already, but we also have a wealth of ideas No, don't forget that actually, if we talk about Africa, the youth population are actually well educated, and they just want to get a job and move forward. So there are so many ideas. I just want to say something about risks and de-risk just shortly, because I think what we can do as an NGO in the partnership actually is to de-risk for some companies. We've been working in these countries for many years, and if we find the right match, we certainly also have issues with reputational damage when we engage with private sector. But if we can find each other, I actually think our sector, together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, can do a lot of de-risking for companies, and that's important to remember.
So your hand is ready, Birgitte.
It is.
Yeah, Dan Jørgensen.
And by the way, if there was no such thing as risk, there wouldn't be banks in this world. Monetizing risk is what they do for a living. So in that sense, there is some business opportunities here also, obviously, right? I think it's a great question, though, because it is difficult. When you get the IPCC reports, I've been reading them for more than 20 years, and it's always depressing. And you're not surprised because you know what they will say, but you are surprised because it's always even worse than it was before, right? And on all the other issues that I've worked on in my political life, there's always problems. That's what a politician do, solve problems. But what is encouraging is that when you go into a room with the experts on the topic, most often you'll come out of that room thinking, okay, so it's bad, but it's not that bad.
We'll get to that with our experts.
Exactly.
I promise.
No. But on this issue, whenever you're in a room with experts, when you walk out of that room, you're always thinking, it's even worse than we thought, right? So even though there are lots of good examples out there, they are minute and they are small compared to what we need. We cannot even get $100 billion a year for climate investments, and we need trillions. So basically, there's no hope.
No. Not very hopeful.
No. After COP15, I was so depressed, I actually thought about, okay, I need to do something else with my life because I don't have the stamina, the stomach to do this. But then I spent some months working in the European Parliament on concrete solutions and also writing a book about it. And I chose the title of the book before I had written the book, which was Green Hope in Danish. So I gave myself the assignment to write a positive book of why it is that we can actually, after the failure in Copenhagen in 2009. And one quote that I love is a British author who said, remember, Martin Luther King, he did not start a civil rights organization or revolution by giving a speech that was called, I Have a Nightmare. Right? Obama did not do all the great things he did in the American society by fear-mongering. He spoke about hope. So hope is the strongest force we have. The narrative of hope is so strong that we need to find it in ourselves. So let's, even though the examples are too few and too small, let's use these examples to create the narrative we started talking about. Get the data right, get the methodology right, use all of the political force that we can, and make things happen. Because maybe actually the forces of the market is not good or evil. Depends how you use it. A completely free market will almost always lead to disaster, in my opinion. But if you actually use the market forces so that you make the good things cheaper and the bad things more expensive, to put it as banal as I can, that might be what saves us. And back to the risk. Yes, there's risk, but what if that was what the financial market chose to make their money on, taking that risk, and we could help them as governments?
We have another question. Patrick, you have a short
on
remark?
this point of hope, my take is I'm neither a pessimist or an optimist, but I'm determined.
That's called radikal in Denmark.
Okay, I'm a radical. I'm not sure whether that's the right label here, but I'm a radical. I'm radical.
There are not so many of them.
And why?
And
Why, Mr. Minister? Because there is force in numbers. Right. the same 100 large companies in Davos which I referenced who spoke about the implication on their financial bottom line, they also said, well, actually, if we were to invest in climate adaptation measures, right, risk proving their assets and their supply chains, what were the costs? $36 billion on aggregate of these 100 companies. But what if we don't do this? $800 billion. So in essence, inaction is expensive. And I think yesterday I had a very interesting conversation here in Copenhagen with colleagues from IFU. And one of the colleagues said, actually, what is needed? It needs to move from the CSR department to the risk department in these large companies. And what you said, Mr. Minister, also, what is vital are good examples. Hope needs to be inspired by something which works, because then it can grow. Well, let's give an example. Invesco, one of the largest asset managers in the world, they're setting up now a large adaptation fund. Right? Institutional investors can invest 2 billion euros on aggregate. But then the question is, as you said, in a banal, not that you said a banal, but the banal reference, but what are the asset classes? What is adaptation? I mean, that's where we come in terms of the codification of that also. It's not just politics alone, it's also the nitty-gritty work which needs to come with it. But now on a more sort of, I'm not sure what the Danish expression for that is, but on a more darker side. So
a brief darker side, please.
The brief, but it is an important point. Because as you said, Thomas, we need to look at the middle segment of business. But if you go back to Africa, it's particularly the small and medium enterprises which are hit hard. Why? Because they don't even know what their climate risks are, let alone that they can manage. So I think, in short, there is a choice to be made, right? We are at a crossroad. We either, as the business community and government alike, integrate climate adaptation, or we will be outperformed, outmaneuvered, and quite frankly, out of business.
Time is running. It always does when you have a lot on your mind. There's a question, and if you ask your question and then pass the microphone on to the next one, we'll speed up a little bit with short answers and quick questions.
Okay, I am Sarah Kruger-Falk, and I'm the Executive Director of UN Global Compact in Denmark, and we're a network of businesses that have committed to principles of the UN.
You came to the right place.
Yes, and my question is this dilemma in investment and where companies should focus. You talk about mitigation and adaptation, and we know that with the current pace, we will really be increasing temperature around the world, and we also know that large part of the world will be unlivable in 20 years. So my question to you is, how do we need both. We need, of course, both to mitigate, reduce emissions, and adapt. But you talked about, Patrick, that we need to focus on adaptation as well. But what about reducing the emissions to make sure that we are not just continuing in the same pace?
Okay, that's exactly, Sarah, why we need, as the minister also said, why we need to focus on nature-based solutions, because they do both, right? I mean, would it not be great to have those types of investments?
And just consider Sudan, will that be livable in 20 years?
Let's come back to that and because time is running, like I said, and we want to...
Thank you. I'm Jakob Buster. I'm from Last Mile Climate. It's an NGO focused on climate adaptation in humanitarian context and bridging the gap in particular between the private sector solutions that exist and the humanitarian sector, which I would argue has not been able to take advantage of the private sector solutions at scale. There's been many pilots, but the scale is lacking. And I think the question, Mr. Minister said that we need to think holistically about poverty alleviation and climate adaptation. And I would add to that, include that also forced displacement, because that is often a consequence of these challenges.
And there is a question?
The question is, how do we unlock private sector investments for humanitarian context and scale the solutions that are so badly needed and move from funding to financing, essentially?
Thank you. Thank you for both the questions, and let's take brief answers the last round. And then, Birgitte, would you like to start again?
I can start?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up about the humanitarian work. I mean, we all know that we've never had so many displaced people and refugees in the world as we have today, which also puts a very high demand on the countries where they're living. We think in Europe that we have a lot of refugees, but I think all of us know that the refugees are actually very close to where the conflicts are, and that Africa is hosting a lot of refugees. So I think the whole sort of issue of resource depletion and in hosting refugees and also internally displaced needs investment. And yes, we have many good pilots. We have the nice sweet potatoes for refugee women. But I think we really need to be better at the scalability, and I think there are opportunities for investments. I mean, the whole water section issues, you know, how you truck water or what you do. The same with firewood. I mean, right now, refugees are using firewood for cooking. That really depletes resources. But I actually think there are many good ideas, and I'll look over to maybe Thomas on investors. I mean, there are very good projects that could be scaled. I see a huge potential for scalability.
Thomas,
I'm not going to give names here for Danish companies. I think Thomas, he can figure that out. But I think that there are opportunities.
Thomas Bustrup?
Yeah, there is, and I must say, I'm not saying that Danish companies are better than others, but I'll still say that I'm very proud of the engagement of many Danish companies in the developing world, also within this topic of today. And it's big companies, and it's also small and medium-sized companies that engage. But of course, if you talk about the scale, it's often the bigger investments and the bigger projects, and thereby also the bigger Danish companies that you would look for. So I think there has been a history of Danish investments also in developing countries that I've been quite proud of. But as I mentioned a little bit in my opening remarks, I'm a little bit worried where we are right now, because I think there's a lot of attention, public, on very, very small, I wouldn't even call it mistakes, but things that happen in the developing world that does not happen in Denmark or in Sweden. And if a Danish company's 99 out of 100 times is not intentional, if they come out to something, they will end on the front page of the newspaper. And it's good with transparency, and it's good that people can follow that Danish companies, when they operate out in the world, that they do it in the same manner as they would operate in Denmark. But I mean, I know huge Danish companies that are pulling out of these areas where you need climate adaptation, because the risk of the company reputation is simply too high. So it is a very strict balance that we have right now on this, and I think if we want to continue to have Western technology, know-how and values, investing in these kind of things, and not only Chinese companies, then we need to strike the balance in the right way. I'm all for transparency and openness, but it needs to be done in a fair way.
And that's where the hand of Birgitte comes in, right? The cooperation.
Yes.
I've learned that much in adaptation. A brief remarks then,
sure.
And then...
Well, on mitigation and adaptation, first of all, Patrick said it, nature-based solutions is an example of us being able to do both at the same time. I could also mention again Malawi. So when a third of their infrastructure and energy is damaged or ruined by the typhoons, so if we help them rebuild that, that's both mitigation and adaptation, obviously. Having said that, though, obviously, politically, sometimes it is a zero-sum game. It shouldn't be, but sometimes it is. So the reason why we speak so much about adaptation today, because this is the topic of the conference, obviously, but also there is a bias on mitigation, in my opinion. This is also why I would say both are equally important, adaptation and mitigation, but one of the reasons why we've chosen to spend 60% of our aid on adaptation is that, even though we still need a lot of more investments in mitigation, it's easier to get, don't get me wrong, it's not easy, but it's easier to get investments in mitigation than it is in adaptation. That's why we need governments to take the first steps on this. Now, an example of how we can actually make it, at least from a government perspective, more attractive to make investments in adaptation is what we're doing in the Danish government with giving grants to companies that work with NGOs. They will not get the money if they do not work with an NGO in a developed country. I just went to visit a company yesterday, Orana, på Fyn, in Fynen, an island in Denmark, that produce juices and pulp for marmalade and stuff like that. So they work with a local African NGO. If they did not do that, they wouldn't get the money. So we have public, private, civic working together on making a more sustainable banana production. So this is development, it's climate adaptation, it's public-private, it's even civic. It's just, it has a lot of problems, obviously. It's difficult, it's complex, but it's perfect in the sense that that is exactly what we want to do, and we will do even more. We actually spent many of you will know this, but you might not know it, Patrick, quite a big part of the money that we spend on our budget for development aid, we do by giving the money to NGOs and making them make the actual projects. Obviously, we work together with them, but they are very often better than many of them are present here today, so that's why I'm nodding to some of them. They have local partners, they have the expertise, and they are better than, or at least as good, and can do different things than a government can.
So it is possible. The last remark, Patrick, is yours.
Yeah, very brief. First of all, Jacob, thank you also for your work on last mile communities. Mr. Minister, you referenced your trip to Ethiopia. I was in Kenya last month. Quite frankly, I was in Makueni, sort of in the northeastern part of Kenya, where you really see the climate emergency really coming at you, which they are living.
Yeah.
And thinking about last mile communities, that's the Makueni community in essence. So it was very telling. So you go there, and there are these indeed water harvesting techniques and what have you, but they all have a phone. And with these phones, as part of the project of the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, $25 billion over 5 years, now what you see that digital climate services are being provided for these smallholder farmers. So they know when to harvest, when they know when to bring their livestock to the market, they know what the market prices are, they know how to get access to the credit from banks. Right? So there are these disruptive technologies which work together, in this case, with these sort of vulnerable communities in Makueni. That is sort of these type of best practices, but not just for Makueni. In the last 24 months, $5.2 billion of investments of the African Development Bank, of the World Bank, with support from the Danish government, is now influenced by these types of adaptation, mainstreamed investments in development space. So it's an extremely important topic. The solutions are there, and now we need to bring them to scale, and we have the pathway.
And now you've learned my steps because time is running. Thank you so much to all of our keynote speakers. And the reason I'm rushing is that, as you know, this is a tight schedule this morning. You're going to be presented to a lot of information, a lot of practical things, a lot of ideological things. We even mentioned to talk about the free market this morning. I mean, there's a big world, and there are many topics. But what we'll do now, after having thanked our keynote speakers, is after the appetizers, you could say, let's dig a little deeper into the facts about private investment in adaptation, and let me introduce to you a group of experts and some practical examples, not sweet potatoes, but others, just as interesting. We have a panel of experts that I will invite to get the microphone on, exchange microphones, and then join me up here at the table. Let's see. And after their presentations, we'll take them one by one, and you'll be able to ask questions to them as well. And that goes for online viewers as well as those of you present here in the room today. So, while they are being mic'd up, which is always a little, I think that takes a little time. Yes, you can take a coffee. If you want to, you can take a coffee. You can always take a coffee. But let me see if there's anything we can do over here too. I thought it was only with, you know, women with a lot of hair that it was, you don't have that much hair. But as soon as you're ready, please join me up here. So, meeting is, yes, you are, thank you. Nå, det er godt. Vi går over tid, men vi må samle op. Vi indhenter det, ja. See, you never say coffee because how am I going to get them back?
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Yeah.
What time were we in theory meant to start this?
In theory,
you should never have invited them for coffee.
I know. In theory, we should have ended a long time ago, but don't. I mean, we'll just take it from the question time. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's difficult to have a short
Minister level.
And it's important, I guess. Okay, I didn't mean it that literally about the coffee. Can you come back to your seats, please? I know I opened the floor for coffee. Now I'm taking it back. Yeah. Okay, please come back to me. Bring your coffee, come back, sit down. Be quiet. I'll never be able to make it as a school teacher. Kids!
Det var en kort kaffepause.
Der var ikke nogen kaffepause.
Det var da ikke lige sagt.
Jo, men det var lidt en fejl. Okay, we'll move on. And this is because not that I don't want you to talk to your friends, but please sit down and tak, Gitte. Okay, let's move on. You'll have the opportunity to mingle after our presentations as well. I know I started this. I'm sorry. I'm taking it all back. So please take your coffee and sit down, and I'll introduce to you our panel of experts, and we'll have a roundtable conversation. Welcome, Nitin Jain, Director of Program, Global Center of Adaptation. Please, let's welcome him. Also, give a hand to Gitte Dyrhagen Husager, Head of Program, Advocacy and Learning, Dan Church 8, standing next to her. And next to Gitte is Henrik Skov Nygaard, Danfoss Climate Solutions Strategy Director, Cold Chain Logistics. I made it. But he's the guy with all the good examples, so you'll be looking forward to that. And meet also Peter Damgaard Jensen, Vice Chair of the Climate Investment Coalition. Give him a warm welcome as well. And Nitin, let's begin. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. And I'd just like to say that we are privileged to be in front of you, but we know that there's a lot of expertise on adaptation within the audience here in this room and online. And we acknowledge that, and as solutions broker, we rely on you to share that experience with us. So indeed, our world is changing. There are a number of trends that are driving these changes, which generate new opportunities for business. In Asia, in Africa, we see rapid urbanization. We see a growing middle class. These create new opportunities, new markets for existing business solutions, and they actually also generate opportunities for new solutions tailored to these regions. At the same time, there are other trends, as we've heard repeatedly today, that are a threat to business. Prior to 1990, there was 0 years in which damages due to natural disasters exceeded $50 billion. Since 1990, there have been only 6 years when the damages were below $50 billion. And it's only going to get worse. So on mitigation, what we try and do is to make sure that the temperature in these thermometers doesn't rise. But I think the really important message from today is that there is no version of the future where the trends on climate change doesn't require investing in solutions to help us adapt to these changes. Even in the most optimistic scenario, if we can reduce global warming to a minimal, we're going to see 270 million people be water stressed. We're going to see yields on maize and other crops decrease by 8%. This is a business risk. We're going to see cities around the world incur costs of over $10 trillion due to climate risk. There is no safe climate scenario. And this is why, as we've heard repeatedly today, investing in reducing these risks is not just about the planet, it's not just about people. Of course, that is important, but it's also about the survival of business. Now, this is not just rhetoric. You heard my CEO, Patrick, speak about the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. $5.2 billion influenced. I will share some examples on what that means and what the role of the private sector has been in those examples. This has been achieved in just 2 short years. So now imagine what we can do if we work together for the next 10 years, for the next 50 years. Some examples. Practical investments on the ground, which some of you, I'm sure, are already involved with. The African Development Bank and the European Investment Bank are financing a refurbishment project, investment project, with the port of Banjul in the Gambia, West Africa. GCA worked with African Development Bank to start understanding, well, okay, you're putting in $100 million, but what are the climate risks for this $100 million? And so we work with private climate analytics firms. We work with engineering experts, in this case, Royal Huskening. And we start understanding, well, okay, what is the asset exposed to? What are the consequences of that exposure? What does this mean in terms of damages, not just to the port itself, but also to the trade that goes through the port, to the people that need to carry food and other goods from one side of the river, if you've been to the Gambia, to the other, where the market might be. And what we found is that in order for this investment to be climate resilient, we needed to invest $10 million extra. $5 million in CapEx interventions, $5 million in OpEx interventions. So CapEx included things like designing the jetty differently, protecting energy sector assets within the port facilities, and OpEx related to how the port is actually managed. Now, the African Development Bank, the Gambia Ports Authority, and EIB are taking these interventions, taking the recommendations that are prioritized. These are bankable investments. Investing in these will have a return for this project, and they will integrate this into the investment design. So on this project, we're first of all working with the Gambia Ports Authority. They manage trade, 80% of the trade in and out of the Gambia. We're working with climate analytics firms. We're working with engineering firms. These are all opportunities for the business community on the design of adaptation solutions. Another example in the food sector. Again, my CEO already mentioned that we're working in integrating digital solutions through investments on the ground. Now, multilateral development banks and governments are financing billions of dollars in food-related interventions. These investments go in at the farm level, at interventions on the ground. They go in on the input level, so seeds and other sort of supply chains that are needed at the farm level. They go in at the market level. The minister mentioned in Afar there are markets that aggregate onions from farmers. And these are important stakeholders in the value chain. There's digital solutions that can be integrated across these value chains that can help each of these stakeholders, in some cases businesses, understand climate risk and respond to climate risk. And what GCA is doing with the African Development Bank and the World Bank in projects such as the one on the slide in the Sahel is to understand what are these solutions, which ones are profitable, which ones will make an impact, which ones will deliver adaptation solutions, and integrate that into their investments. Another example of what we're doing in Senegal is under climate finance, where in the first 2 examples, we needed to invest on the ground, but we also see the need that the financial system needs to be able to access funding, which exists. We keep hearing there's trillions of dollars out there, but then why is it that countries like Senegal and Kenya and Ethiopia can't access these? And so what we're doing on the climate finance program is to work with local banks, local institutions, to become accredited to global climate funds like the Green Climate Fund. And once they are accredited, to be able to prepare the analytical concept notes that are required to unlock those investments. In Senegal, we're working with the president, with his government, and with local institutions, with a vision of unlocking $1 billion through global climate finance for investments on the ground. Now, all of these are individual interventions. But if you think back to the Port of Banjul example, what we're starting to do is we're starting to price climate risk. We're starting to price the value of an adaptation solution. And these are really 2 really important data points that are required to unlock private sector investment in adaptation. Because if you can't understand, well, what is the cost of adaptation, if you can't understand when I invest in building this wall slightly higher so that the floodwater doesn't come in, what is that return for me as an investor, you can't actually unlock private sector investment. And so GCA is not just working on the Port of Banjul, we're not just working on one farm in the Sahel, we're working across a portfolio in over 20 countries already with plans to scale up across the continent. But the idea is that over the period of this, the AAAP, the $25 billion program, we will start being able to understand what is climate risk within the port sector, for roads, for the energy sector, for urban settings. And with that data, we really hope that the private sector starts picking up these investments, starts understanding what is adaptation, what is the business case for it, and they start financing these interventions themselves. I'd like to just close briefly then with GCA working at the investment level is critical. Working to influence investments on the ground is critical. But at the same time, if we don't link this with a political engagement, it doesn't scale. And so through our advocacy programs, the AAAP is not just about investment, it is also about mobilizing the political agenda. The summit last year in our office in Rotterdam, heads of state, not just from Africa, but also from Europe, leaders of international organizations coming together to bring this investment agenda on adaptation to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitin. And let's quickly, Gitte Dyrhagen-Hussager, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very
much. And you'd like another slide, I guess.
I would. Someone to help me.
Can you begin without it?
There you go. Thank you very much. So I'm here representing the two extra P's, the public-private partnerships, and then we have the people and planet. And I think the minister actually put it really well, public, private, civic. I think we are here hosting today's conversation. We've had actually conversations for very long and partnerships with GCA, with Danfoss. We've been in dialogue since 2017 on how to make investments in adaptation, and today we're actually launching our partnership together. And I think also from Peter, I know you are an expert on resilience. I think the only CEO I know who has really grabbed the climate adaptation agenda and can speak about that. So we launched the report and put that in motion because we felt the conversation really hadn't trickled down to the people where the need is biggest. We therefore gathered a group of people, experts, companies, investors, civil society, those representing the most vulnerable, last year to develop the report that you have in your seats. And the question really was, we know adaptation as a definition. We don't know how to unlock these investments. But actually, we feel like we have the solution because we are pipeline developers. We may not seem that way, but NGOs are business developments at heart because we're out there, we know the problems, we engage with the communities, we're in the refugee settlements where climate changes are real. And then it's very easy for us to engage in conversations with companies and also with investors. That's a little bit more tricky, but we're getting there because we're developing the bankable and investable projects. And this is the real definition from the Rio markers, where you see two really interesting terms. One thing is these are vulnerabilities of human and natural resources. A key central theme is the resilience that we are increasing, and that is DCA's core business. We do resilience on social, economic, human resource financing models. And then someone needs to help reduce exposure to these risks, and this is where we come in. Because we cannot expect companies themselves to see a challenge and go and invest in their own right. I mean, we're out there where the business case is weakest. That's our mandate. So I think we are developing slowly these solutions. You see a long list here of business opportunities. NCG helped prepare this report, I think, for the people who were in the reference group. It really was a journey in itself to look at the business opportunities. These are many nice words on ecosystem-based approaches, water management, digital climate services, which we have developed ourselves. We're working with Ugandan fintech companies that we've helped incubate with innovation funds from our good strategic partnership with Danita. Now it's a fintech company in its own right that is providing access to finance digitally for village saving loans associations, so that the women themselves can access finance and exit out of development funding, and on their own right invest in the climate resilient crops, in getting access to more land, in putting people to schools. And Birgitte and I saw that with our own eyes when we were in Uganda last week. It works. We have brought them to one of the local development banks, Abbey Finance. I know that they are out there somewhere. That IFU is also closely working with. Getting access to finance via local financial intermediaries is really key to making this a success, because it's not the Danfosses of the world that we can expect to invest in the forest. It is really the local companies, and here we work with DI on that. So the conclusion, blended finance models are needed, but I think we also have to challenge the way we look at blended finance, because I think we feel sometimes in the civil society community we're maybe a bit left out of that conversation. Actually, we do that business very often. We have the grants, we have the ideas, we also have access to Danish philanthropic funds, to climate finance funds that are more and more looking into this, but someone needs to do the hard work of developing the investment cases. And I think we succeed if we work together, but we can't do it alone. I think a last point for me is that we're also in the business of de-risking. I think you put it really well, Birgitte. De-risking is also managing human rights risks. And it's not just managing them as a tick box exercise and living up to new EU legislation on human rights due diligence, but we also have to do that. We also need to work proactively with making human rights good business. It's actually a really bad business not to work with human rights and not to engage broad stakeholders. And this is our core mandate in my title. I luckily have advocacy also, and this is what we bring to the table. We bring knowledge, we bring access to networks. We were with Danfoss in January. We developed a wonderful program in Kenya where Danfoss got access to the rights holders, the communities, the local municipalities. This was not a trade delegation. This was a partnership where we went together to see and look at the context and how to make business, good business out of that. So I think there was my...
I'll be doing my dance now, Gitte. Yeah?
Yeah.
Your time is up. Thank you. And now, let's hear from the man you're smiling at all the time, because you have a good cooperation. Henrik Skov Nygaard, please, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm Henrik, I'm from the Danish company Danfoss, and I'm here to tell you about an experience we had with a public-private partnership in India. So for those of you who don't know Danfoss, we are a Danish company. We have 42,000 colleagues around the world, and we are every day working on making energy-efficient solutions that allows the green transition. We have a turnover of about 10 billion euros, and we have more than 100 factories in 100 different countries in the world. So we are a global company, but we are founded in Denmark, and our headquarters are in the south of Denmark. All the different energy-efficient solutions we have are grouped into 3 pillars. So we have one that is called Danfoss Power Solutions. They make primarily hydraulics, so that enables energy-efficient agricultural machines, construction equipment, electrification of ferries, and these kind of things. Then we have Danfoss Climate Solutions, which is where I'm from, where we control temperature accurately. This is also where we were founded in 1933. Our founder developed an expansion valve that could really operate a refrigerator at the right temperature, and thereby also having a more stable temperature, but also reduce energy consumption. So this is really in our DNA for the last 90 years, that we want to make more with less. We want to make sure that we don't consume more energy than we really need to. And only by reducing our energy consumption, we have hope for the green transition, because then we need to make less green energy. The last part is Danfoss Power Solutions drives that also make speed control of electric motors, and also they make components for electric cars. So all of this is really something that moves towards the green transition. That's a bit about us as a company. But the story I'm here to share with you today is about banana farmers in India, where we entered into a project with the Indian Cold Chain Association. In India, they produce every 3rd banana in the world, so it's really quite a big deal in India, bananas. And in the state of Tamil Nadu, they make 1/3 out of this 3rd banana. So that means that approximately 10% of all the bananas in the world come from the state of Tamil Nadu. So this is really quite a big deal, and there's a lot of farmers in Tamil Nadu. However, 30% of the bananas, they were lost after being harvested. So of course this is a big problem. Food waste is a huge problem in the world, and if it emits approximately 8 to 10% of the global carbon emissions come from food waste. So it's really something that matters if we can do something about it. However, we also learned that relatively small investments could help on the case in this situation here. Let's see. Oops. There we go. So the public-private sector cooperation that we were part of in India was where we teamed up with the Indian Cold Chain Association, where we tried to understand why do these 30% losses happen. Then, of course, all these findings, they were presented to the local government and actions were put in place. One of the findings were that we needed to increase awareness about how you handle the bananas, but also there was a lack of infrastructure. So in order to mitigate this and to do something about it, we put some actions in place and we held 3 banana festivals together with our partners to increase the awareness. How do we handle the bananas? What can infrastructure do to extend the life of these bananas? So this was, of course, something that we do together with farmers and also with local NGOs, but also authorities. And only by doing so, we can expect to see results. Let's see if that... So the benefits that came, let's see, yes, it's there. So the benefits that came out of this was that now we have cool storage facilities in place. So that means that when the farmers, they harvest the bananas, they can put them into a cold storage. And this means that the bananas no longer go bad by being left in the sun or outside. They're kept at the accurate temperature. So the quality is better of the bananas, but also they have a longer lifetime. So that means that these farmers, they can now have a better product and they have more of it. Also, we installed ripening chambers. So that means that now the farmers, they are in control of when do they ripen the bananas. So they have a better product, they have more of it, and they can now also better control when it needs to ripen. So this allowed the farmers to increase their income quite dramatically, because when you have food waste, you still have all the expenses to produce your bananas, but you just lose a lot of it. But investing in infrastructure means that they keep more of it, and therefore also their incomes increase quite dramatically. Some of them made twice as much money, but some of them even made 3 times as much money as previously. And this has an impact also on the local society, because then they will keep doing it, they make more money, they see this really works, and then they will do it again and again, and likely this will spread to other areas as well, because they get inspired. Then let's hope this...
Well,
there we go.
Right.
So this is also where we're quite happy to announce that we'll be working with the Danish Church Aid, Inspire Farms, also with the Fresh Produce Exporters Association of Kenya and the Danish Ministry of Foreign Aid, where we will be working with projects in Kenya, where we hopefully can where we can see similar results, where we can create a positive spiral for the farmers and for the local communities. So we can see that we can make the sustainable business model and financing solution for the small and medium-sized enterprises as well as for the farmers, and thereby create the positive spiral. So this is something that we're quite excited about joining this project with a lot of wonderful partners, because we understand technology from the Danfoss side, but we need a lot of experts to be able to be successful. So we need to understand the local needs, we need funding. All these kind of things need to be in place, and only then, by cooperating, you will be successful. Let's see, I think my 7 minutes...
Oh, don't forget the 7 minutes, because...
yeah.
It's a nice ending.
Yeah, so thank you.
Did you have a closing remark, Henrik? You should be allowed to have a closing remark.
Yeah, well, I just...
You won't get an applause, but you can make your vote.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. But I think it's really wonderful to be able to do these things. We understand technology, and we want to work with a lot of experts around the world. Also, we want this local knowledge in order to be successful, because ultimately, if we all make money, we will keep doing it, and it will allow us to move on to new projects again and again and again.
And what you're saying is you can't do it alone.
No.
Next to you is Peter Damgaard Jensen. He can't do it alone. He didn't do it alone for the 20 years that he was the CEO of the Danish private pension fund, PKA. We should mention that as well, Peter. But also you're the the former member of the Global Commission on Adaptation, and now you're the vice chair of the Climate Investment Coalition. So please, your 7 minutes is ticking.
Yeah, thank you very much. What I'm saying now is, of course, based on that, but also that I for 7 years was a vice chair and chair of IIDCC. That's a cooperation between large investors in Europe that want to invest in the green area. And that organization have actually grown from around 80 members to over 400. So that's really that something is going on outside, also outside Denmark. I'll first say, come to the positive side. I'll learn a little bit about the negative, and I'm not sure I'm radical, but then, and then a little bit about the solution. On the positive side, we learned in the Climate Investment Coalition, and the Climate Investment Coalition is a group of 30 plus, mainly Nordic investors that have set a target on how much they will invest in the green sector for the next 10 years. This is not something going on to 2040 or 2050, but to 2030. And they would invest $130 billion in the green sector. And that's for many of the pension funds is around 10% of the asset under management. So this is actually a huge sum of money that's going into the green area. The next thing is that, as I said, that if you look into IIDCC, that was a small organization, it has really grown, and it's now a very important organization that organizes how you as an investor, especially a European investor, can work with climate issues. So that's a very positive side, that there is a very big and growing interest from investors to go into the green area. If we go to the more negative side of it, I would say that there are 3 areas where you can invest in, main areas. The one is mitigation, the second one is adaptation, and then the new one is biodiversity. And they are, as we have learned today, in many cases in a kind of family. But if you look at the investors, you would see that I think that more than 90%, maybe 95%, until now has been going into the mitigation area. And the other thing that's important to mention here is that I think that more than 90% are going to the OECD countries. So what we actually are missing, if we look at the problems we are talking about today, is more investments in adaptation and more investments in the emerging markets. I would say that the emerging markets, and there I have my own experience from PK that have invested there, and also for adaptation, there are many reasons for that. We have heard some of them here. In the emerging market, I think it is because a lot of investors think the risks are too high. It might be the perceived risk, but my experience from having invested in emerging market is a real risk, and it is bigger than investing in the developed market. And it's because there's a higher risk on the political side, and there's also a higher risk, for instance, on the currency side. You can work with that, but that's one of the barriers you see from the private sector. And on the adaptation side, I think there's, if you see it from the investor point of view and you go into an investment, you can have 2 kinds of paying back or return. First is you have a running income or a running return coming back to you. That's if you invest in a windmill, in 20 years you will have your money back on the pay or the payment you got from selling the electricity. Or you can create a higher value and then you can sell it at some point and you can get the money back. Until now it has been a little bit difficult to find out how to do that in that adaptation area. And then if I turn to the positive side, then I would say it also took 10 years to learn how you could have private investors in the mitigation area. If we go 10 years back, you nearly didn't have any private investors, especially not institutional investors, in the mitigation. Now you have the SIP, you have all the big investors in the offshore mills and also onshore. So if we work with adaptation, of course we can find new models on how to do it. Then on the solution side, one of the things IIDCC have done and have worked with, and hopefully they are inspired, because I learned a lot when I was in the commission about this was something we had to work with, is that they have created a kind of guidance in what they are calling the Climate Action 100+. This is a continuing dialogue that all these big investors have with the biggest 100 companies in the world, all the large corporates, the Nestles, the Unilevers. Maersk is one of the Danish companies. And there they have put resilience on the agenda. So they ask those big companies, you have to work in a way, especially in the emerging market, where you become climate resilient. But that also means that your supply chain have to be climate resilient. And by that, they get the influence on what's going on the farming side, also among all those small farmers that deliver to Nestle, to Unilever, to Coca-Cola, and so on. And they've also made a special guidance for companies investing or infrastructure funds. So that if you build infrastructure in emerging market, but also in developed market, you have from the beginning to be aware of how can you build resilience into those assets. And that's a big difference from how it was done 20 years ago. Then you build a road, and then 10 years after you found out that it was in an area where there was a lot of flooding. Now you have to do it differently, and you have to tell to your investors how you do it differently. And I think that will put a growing pressure on the large companies to think resilience and adaptation into the way they work. Another ways, and I think also the GCA have worked with that, and I know at least the Netherlands have worked with that, that's green bonds. This is a thing that is created for mitigation, but I think you can put adaptation measures into that. That's low risk in many ways, is guaranteed by governments or even though from international institutions. And I know that pension funds really like to invest in that because it's low risk and you have a public guarantee some way that does that you're quite sure to get your money back. So green bonds is going to be part of what we'll work with in adaptation. But then we are back to how do we as institutional investors really get an outreach to the smallholders out there, the small farmers. And there I would say that microfinance is a way to do it. We haven't found a solution really to get microfinance and adaptation to work together, but I think they can fit together and NGOs can play an important role there. And the reason microfinance is interesting for institutional investors is you can create a fund and then you can put your 200 million or 300 million Danish kroner into that. I mean, that's a small investment for a large pension fund, so they can't reach out to the individual farmers. And that fund can invest in different microfinance institutions. And PKA was part of that for 12 years ago, a fully private one started together with IFU. And now they have invested 2 billion Danish kroner in microfinance. It's in South America, it's in Africa, it's in Asia. It has done an outreach to 10 to 15 million small, either in the countryside or also in cities, in small businesses. And I know there's been made a similar Norwegian one where there are also Danish institutional investors as part of that. And the good thing is actually, it looks to be also create good money for the investors. Because it's quite simple. If it doesn't do that, then it stops. But this looks to be an opportunity to come out there. And I think one of the things that are missing in some of these projects, as far as I have seen, is that they need technical assistance on the local level. And these microfinance institutions are not able to do that. But there I think NGOs can step in and work together and by that create an even higher value on that kind of investments. So looking forward, I think there are opportunities. I think it will not be easy, but it wasn't easy when we invested in Anholt Vindmøllepark 10 years ago. People thought we were crazy. That's one of PK's best investments. And I think, and I will not mention what we can do with blended finance, because I think that's also a case, but microfinance was one part of doing it. But I think there's a place both for the public and for the NGOs to work together with private investors to try to develop these investments in adaptation And we are only at the beginning on doing that.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you very much. So, thank you for all your presentation. I would like you to sort of scoot over, can you perhaps come a little over on this side? Because we're going to invite a couple of more people to the table. Yes. Let's welcome Søren Peter Andreasen. Where are you, Søren? There you are, coming from the back. And you are the Deputy CEO of IFU, Investment Fund for Developing Countries. And you could perhaps explain why I'm inviting you to the table now. What exactly is the role of the IFU in this connection?
Thank you, and great to be here with all of you. So IFU is the Danish Development Finance Institution. Our job is to finance pioneering and scaling of solutions to these kinds of problems, but other development challenges as well in the private sector. And the way we look at adaptation as a challenge, and it's definitely right that we are doing more now than we were 10 years ago. The way we look at it is to go in and say, and I think the services to smallholder farmers is a very good example. What is it that can be done to increase the incomes of these smallholder farmers in a way that they can become more resilient, but they can maybe even, because we are paying more attention, we are bringing new technology and new financing to them, they can even have better livelihoods in the future. And I think we are doing a lot. Of course, there are many smallholder farmers who are very vulnerable and who are seeing really devastation due to oncoming climate changes and disasters. But I do also think there's a lot of positive developments happening in the market, certainly where we are active. And I might just like to mention a few examples. So we've seen over the last years services to smallholder farmers, access to finance through deployment of technology, but also access to electricity with distributed renewable energy solutions. Not technically maybe qualified as adaptation financing, but if you equip smallholder farmers with access to these types of services at affordable prices, you can really see that it helps their incomes and their capacity to become higher earners and more successful in their economies. I'd like to highlight two things that we are doing actually with the Danish SDG Fund, which is a partnership with Danish pension funds, and which, Peter, I think you have some responsibility for the launch of this fund now 5 years ago. The fund is almost fully invested, but we have two very recent investments in adaptation that rhyme with some of the things that came up here, and I just wanted to mention it. One is a very large investment in grain silos in partnership with Indian authorities, providing top-of-the-line grain silos for 30,000 farmers in an Indian province. Just like with the bananas, they're losing up to 40% of what is produced before it comes to consumers. That's of course a huge loss in potential income for these farmers. Now with these silos, their crop can keep for up to 5 years instead of either going to waste or keeping for less than a year. Another example is services to smallholder farmers. We just very recently invested in a company called Suminter, which in Uganda, but also in Indian provinces, are helping smallholder farmers convert to organic agriculture and access international markets. You can imagine we can just go to our supermarket and see that this means that some of their crop can be twice as income giving as what they were producing before. And the fact that they have access to services and technologies from large partners also means that it will be easier for them to convert to other more resilient crops if needed where they operate their agriculture. So I think there are many, many good opportunities, and we are clearly doing more.
Thank you. And let's invite yet another person to our table. You can spread out if you want to. Meet Karin Poulsen, representing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. Karin heads the Department for Green Diplomacy and Climate and is deeply involved in Denmark's engagement on the green agenda. And Karin, the reason why you're invited up here as well is for you to know their faces and their names, and perhaps be part of the responding to some of the questions that you have. That is running speed. The time is running very rapidly. But could you, you'll have the opportunity as well to explain what is the role of the ministry in adaptation and private investments?
Thank you very much, Mette, and thank you a lot for super inspiring discussions. Well, I think essentially I'm here to implement the vision of my political master. The minister was just here, so I don't think I have too many things to add, though. But I think as far as the ministry is concerned, you could see from the minister's title that it now has development cooperation and global climate policy. So it's in fact two departments. It's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry for Climate, Energy and Public Utilities that have kind of been combined. So we're now 75 staff altogether trying to underpin this agenda. And whereas the Climate Ministry used to have kind of the ressort on mitigation, and we used to have it on adaptation and finance and loss and damage, we can now all combine it. And I think we have a super opportunity globally to kind of, flesh out and shape the global narrative, as the minister said, but also in the climate negotiations. Annually, there's a UN conference on climate, the COP negotiations that they're called. It will be in Dubai in December this year. So now, our minister at least, he has the entire kind of floor on mitigation, adaptation, finance, and in climate-induced loss and damage. So we're very ambitious on negotiations, but we are also ambitious on actions. As we have discussed, mobilization and provision of data, we support a lot of global partnerships providing these data, but we will also go down to the ground, to Ethiopia, for instance, as we have discussed, to have concrete projects. Then we're trying to be an influencer. Apart from being ambitious, we're also an influencer, even though you can think we might be a bit of a dusty department. We are an influencer because Denmark is a small country and our millions are few. Now we have heard about trillions and the moonshots and whatever it's called, but we're trying to influence others to follow. When it comes to the grant provision, you have heard that 30% of our green aid goes to climate and 60% of that to adaptation. But we want adaptation to move up on the agenda. That's what we discussed at the Copenhagen Climate Ministerial some days ago. Adaptation has to move up on the global agenda, and it's locally led. Sometimes it's even personal. So we want others to move with us on grants and on the political mobilization. Then we want to be innovative. That's the third and last one. Grants can never do it alone, as we've heard, to reach the climate ambitions and to close the finance gaps. That's why we're standing here together today with private sector. We're very open-minded. That's why we partner with civil society. And I know many of you are, for instance, part of our Danida Green Business partnership program, where we're trying to combine public, private, civic, as we have discussed today. So we're really trying to be innovative, engaging private sector, and also going for the trillions, because the multilateral development banks really have to come into a different gear. And we're starting with the World Bank, and others will follow. So that's what we're doing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So, an impressive crowd, you might say, and now the floor is open. We have around 15 minutes for you to ask questions. You can do it online in the chat, or you can raise your hand and introduce yourself, and we'll take it from here. There is one right here. We need to get you a microphone. It's coming up.
Thank you very much. I'm Stella Bøcker from the Confederation of Danish Industry. So if you're a company here today and you want to take the first steps, you want to invest in adaptation, what would be your best advice to them to get engaged, to get a strategy, to get some insights into the topic? Thank you.
Who would like to answer that question? I'd like to add as well, and do you have to be Danfoss or Maersk? Maybe that's some of the audience would like to know. Yes, yeah, Gitte?
Come seek some of the knowledge around the table. I know there are lots of other NGOs. I see CARE, Plan International, WWF. And let's have a conversation around what your solution actually does, because I think we need to start there. As I think we've heard, I think we already have an MOU with IFU to really go into what does adaptation mean. It has been a conversation with Danfoss also. I think we need to co-create because we don't have those solutions at hand, and therefore being very open. And then we need to use the public funding that can gear these innovative solutions. We need to push them so that they also remain innovative, because we don't necessarily know the business case before going into the markets. Everyone who has been in this business for 10 years, as I know, that this is hard. But I think having that open conversation and really diving into adaptation, not just as a single business. I think we've been focusing on the business case as a single business for too long. DCA is looking now at impact financing models. So from the design phase, we have the farmers, we have the nature, we have the companies, and there have to be many. Danfoss is one, Maersk is another, but I probably wouldn't trust the food transformation agenda only with them. We also need to grow other things than bananas. Maybe the farmers should change their growing practices to something that serves the local market, that doesn't have the same CO2 emissions. So broaden out the conversation and have a design thinking around how does this become sustainable? What are the finance institutions available, the local banks, the microfinance? And let's start from there, not focusing in small, but big, and be concrete.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else would like to give an... Yes, Peter?
If I should use the experience we have from the financial sector, then of course you have to do your homework and try to analyze how you can do it and what kind of business model. And the second thing would ask some of your peers in your business if they have done it, how they have done it, both the good side and also what's not been so good. But then at some point you just have to do it. I think that at least for some years there was a lot of investors saying, oh, this is too risky and we'll just be on the sideline and wait to see what happens. And then suddenly they realized in the mitigation area, if they were not part of what was going on 2 or 3 years ago, they might miss the train. So that's something to and I think the same will happen in some ways with adaptation in a few years. There will be more opportunities, and if you are in that sector and are part of that, you will see the opportunities before others.
Mm-hmm. But can you blame the companies for saying, well, we'll just sit over here and wait and see how it goes with the rest of them? I mean, do you understand?
No. This is a decision on your strategy and your leadership. Mm-hmm. But if you want to develop a company, you can't do that on all questions.
Thank you. Anybody? Yeah, another question?
I'm here. Yeah, Fie Lauritsen from Dan Church Aid. A question in terms of women in the sector, and women especially as smallholder farmers. I think we have around 75% of the smallholder farmers in Africa being women. So how do we ensure that investments are also promoting the equal participation and meaningful participation of women, and also making them the change agents that we want to see? Because a few years ago we actually did a study in DCA in the Nordic countries, looking and analyzing the Nordic countries' programming for climate financing, and how much of that was integrating a gender aspect, and very, very little of climate financing is addressing gender and addressing gender equality. So I'm curious to know, especially from the ministry side, but from IFU and from Peter's side as well, how do you consider gender as part of your investments? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Well, in ministry, we don't have a feministic foreign policy yet. It's maybe a matter of time. Who knows? But we definitely do what we do through a gender lens. There's no doubt about that, because what we also heard in the first panel from Birgitte and others is that women are really at the front line of this, and when climate disasters hit, they are hit the hardest. So I think in terms of the private sector, also to the previous question, I think now Thomas from DI talked about the reputational risk of engaging in this. I think there will be a reputational risk if you don't engage. Because, I mean, now we have been discussing human rights, decent jobs, etc., for many years. If you don't engage in trying to combat climate change, I think there will be a reputational risk. And we will inspire private companies, and so will the civic side, to actually see this through a gender lens. We can't do without it.
Just from Are we on? From the point of view of IFU, we've committed ourselves 4 or 5 years ago to being among the impact criteria we have when we invest. We look at gender-related criteria. And today it's a little bit less than half of our investments that qualify on as gender lens based on a commitment we've made to something called 2X Challenge, but it's a set of criteria that are public and you can consult also on our website. But part of why we are leaning into investments that relate to smallholder farmers is exactly not just because of adaptation, but also because of the results you can achieve in terms of driving gender equality. So we see a much higher proportion of the investments, like the ones I mentioned before, that have these aspects. And that means we come in with impact plans and criteria that we negotiate with the clients upfront, so we make sure that they really deliver on the gender aspects of their investment plans, and I think that really actually also drives positive financial results. So it makes a lot of sense to do it.
If I may, I really like the first question as well, right? Which is, if you're a company looking to get started, what do you do? And I think you sort of got to it a little bit, but take inspiration from the front runners. And I did want to, there's at least 2 Indians in this group, and I don't know if there's other people from what we call the global south. But Indians, Africans, amongst the most resilient people that I know. So when I say take inspiration from the front runners, it's, you have to also look globally at who is doing what. I lived and worked in Sierra Leone. People managing the energy sector there are incredibly innovative on how to manage a very broken system in a very difficult environment. And responding to climate emergencies, Bangladesh has great examples, India, Africa, these, take inspiration from the front runners. On the gender thing question, so what we were reflecting here is, and you said it as agents of change, I think that's really important. But the other side of that story is also to start looking at how is climate affecting different people differently. So you could look at wealth quintiles, you can look at gender, you can look at other sort of factors of vulnerability and opportunity. But some work we did in Ghana, for example, we looked at how women and men use transport assets differently, especially in the countries, India, where I come from, Africa, where I work. Women and men use infrastructure differently. So you'll generally find that the drivers are men, people walking along the streets are women, maybe accessing healthcare, accessing education, etc. And so if you don't understand how these assets are used differently, you don't necessarily understand the impacts of climate change through a gender lens. And so there's, I think, multiple angles to that question, starting to understand, well, how does climate affect different people differently? And then as agents of change, I think that's a really, really important point, and that requires purposefully ensuring that you're saying that our metrics will say that X% of our investment must go to women-owned enterprises. That might seem trivial, but these are really important metrics that can actually drive the change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to build on the story of the sweet potato farmers. So when we visited them last week, the women came up and what they asked me for, how can I access loans? That was their question. So not, small microfinance, like a real loan. So hereby serving it, because I think the solutions are out there. I think there are many studies of how when investing in women, women cater for a broader resilience framework, both for the nature, for the families. It's a good investment simply. And I think IFU, you've done with Sex and Samfund, a really, really good collaboration, and I think an innovative one on how to invest. Now I think we need to get more microfinance into seeing the good business here, and I think it would be wonderful that we could go back to the women soon and say we've actually promoted financial inclusion on adaptation through IFU, through Abbey Finance, so that the people, they're already in dialogue with you. So, so I think we're able to connect the dots more and bring the women to the front.
Interesting. There's an online question, I think. You don't have a microphone.
Yeah, you can get here, Matthias.
There are actually many questions online, so but I'll just take a few quite quickly. World Bank group, IFIs, I think Nitin, you mentioned them. How can we really use them in relation to adaptation? And is there need for a change to make them accessible? And then carbon offsetting, that's also a discussion. can this benefit adaptation? Is it possible to make some changes there? And then regulatory barriers. What are there any, and what are they? Is there anything which can be changed? For example, subsidies and other rules which hinders this kind of investments.
Okay, so there are so many questions and so little time, right? Story of my life. But let's say that you'll have your comments. We're rounding up because we have 5 minutes left, and if everyone would like to have a comment. But then I'm very, very sure that all these wonderful people standing up here are very interested in talking to you physically after our event, and also available on email and so on, so that those questions that we don't have time to hear can be answered that way. Right. So, Niti, there was a concrete question for you, I think. If we start over here and then just move over like that, please.
Okay. On the IFIs, I think a really important starting point is to recognize that they have an incredible body of knowledge on how to manage adaptation, mitigation, all aspects of development. But these might be concentrated in specific sectors, specific countries. But I think that they play a massive role already in driving the agenda. And we learn from them, we work with them. So that's just an important starting point, centers of knowledge. Then secondly, it's important to understand, and again, coming from the perspective of GCA, where our interest is in Africa and Asia, where these institutions are already financing billions of dollars in investments that are making the lives of people better, right? And what we're talking about then is how can those investment streams also deliver adaptation outcomes? And that's the goal of the AAAP, the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, where we're already influencing the 5.2 billion. But I won't get into what are the changes required within the institutions, but I think that the big opportunity here is, as the minister said, is to bring the development agenda, which these institutions are delivering on, and the climate agenda together, so that it's not, what is the dollar in climate change and what is the dollar over there on development, but bringing these two together so that you're driving the engine for growth, and that growth delivers resilience and prosperity. Maybe I'll let...
Thank you. Henrik, you haven't said anything for a while. I'll give the word to you now.
Thank you. On any particular question or just a closing remark?
Closing remark, if you don't find it, you have...
So, well, yeah, I think it's quite important that we need to cooperate together with whoever has the knowledge. There's this thing that we are trying to tackle is really a huge problem. So we need a lot of different organizations to be able to cooperate. We need a lot of different skill sets to be able to cater the right solutions for the problems. And it's not going to be one solution that fits everything. So that is why we are happy in Danfoss. We have a global organization where we can fit to local needs, but also we are happy to work with a lot of wonderful partners that bring different knowledge. We come from the technology angle, but we also need the finance angle. We need the human angle. Like, is it really good business to do business with a lot of women? It likely is, right? But this is not our core competence to understand that. So that is why we rely on a lot of very good partners to make successful projects. And only thereby we can hopefully create a positive spiral in many areas of the world, but also reduce the impacts of climate change, because we do make better solutions based on the knowledge we already have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, to the question, first of all, I think it's important that the DFI changes the role. I have seen some cases where they actually crowd out private capital. They should crowd in private capital and take the more risky part. So that's, I look very much forward to see what's going to happen there. And then carbon offsetting and adaptation, one way I can see it is in nature-based solutions. If you work with that as a kind of adaptation, then you can also work with it as carbon offsetting if you grow new forest or whatever you do. So you can combine the things, and that's also what we have to learn.
Mm-hmm. Søren, Peter Andreasen?
Yeah, I agree with Peter that DFI should not crowd out private investors, and also that we should try and see how carbon credits and carbon trading can benefit adaptation objectives. I think the big challenge there is that these are very complex international climate finance aspects related to permitting and carbon trading and so on. And if we don't really have a focused effort on it, it's very unlikely ever to benefit smallholder farmers or other low-income people. But the fact is that these farmers can actually do things that have great climate effects. using fertilizer in a different way or not at all, regenerating agricultural land or forest or be part of doing that. But they're very likely, unless we make a specific effort, ever to benefit from any carbon permits that come out of that. And that's where I think development institutions can play an important role.
Kai?
Thank you. Well, first and foremost, we have to make gender a core competence of Danfoss. I think that was a very bad excuse. That is not your competence. Sorry to tease you a little bit. Anyways.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. I think as far as financing is concerned, now we talk about the multilateral development banks, but there's so much money needed for this. So I think what we're looking into now as well is kind of innovative, financing sources, taxing on shipping, taxing on aviation, etc., etc. Just this week, Denmark is sharing a seat on the transitional committee on finding solutions on climate-induced loss and damage. We need to establish some sort of fund, innovative financing modules coming out of the last COP. So we really need to be innovative to go to scale. But I think on the multilateral development banks, what we very concretely is trying to do in a partnership with GCA, the Global Center on Adaptation, is to influence these huge banks. And we're doing it quite concretely now with the African Development Bank, and we just got a program approved yesterday where we will work in cities with the African Development Bank, because in cities that's really the new kind of arena also for adaptation, as has been mentioned. And we do that with GCA to really flavor how such a huge MDB as the African Development Bank is trying to operate. When it comes to good ideas about bankable projects, visit our embassies. We have more than 100 of them around the world. Go to the continents, go and visit them. They have great ideas. And then this is all about partnerships. And that's why we're here together. So thanks a lot for the discussions.
And Gitte, I'll pass the final word to you.
Thank you so much. And I think this conversation, having been in this space for a long time, I think we're also moving from partnerships to alliances. We're moving from investments to financing. So I think we take a broader look on things. DCA last year made a huge impact investment. We decided to take responsibility for 100 years of CO2 emissions from our history. And we've done that through an organization called EcoTrust that is perhaps the most investment case in the world. Maybe if you could have a look. EcoTrust is essentially investing in smallholder farmers that are adapting their land and nature to climate changes. Smallholders get a small income, they can invest in more land, in women, etc. We want to integrate those type of models into a larger scale one. On the World Bank, that is a final thing. We have a new opportunity with a World Bank food fund that is now being set up, and Denmark is a sponsor of that. I think the food systems discussion on climate change and adaptation is unique. We have a food crisis with Ukraine. How can we leverage and influence, as you said, Karen? Maybe not. It's not the pool of funding because we are small fish in the pond. But I think in our systems transformation approach, I think Denmark can set an example.
So, keywords. Now it's my turn. Very brief. Show courage and responsibility, work together and reach out. Is that it? Okay. Thank you so much. Signing off for today. The rain stopped, so it's perfect. Thank you very much. Now you can have your coffee. You would more eating, but it.
No, I can always say more.
You can always say more.
Yeah, but thank you very much.
Tusind tak. Tak, Peter.